Wait, Amtrak had gallery cars? So living in DC, you get used to hearing many different opinions all around you. Makes sense because for a lot of people here, turning political opinions into laws is their job. You know where else you get used to hearing very strong opinions? In the rail fan and transit advocate community. Have you seen how opinionated we can get? There are some subjects, like certain trains and certain projects, that are just so divisive that they quickly fill up comment sections. Just this past June, I uploaded a video about privatization in the European railways, and today we've recovered enough to touch on another touchy subject: gallery cars. Either you love them or you hate them. I've never met anybody that's just indifferent towards them. Despite the controversy, they were a very popular type of train here in the United States. Today there are only 4 commuter rail agencies that still use them, but there used to be so many more railroads that operated them, including Amtrak. So in this video, I will first talk about the history of the gallery car. Then I will explain the design, and then we'll move on to where Amtrak fits into the picture. The gallery car is a design that dates back to the 1950s, when the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad became the first railroad to use them. They were built by the Pullman Company in Chicago. Pullman had a massive manufacturing plant in the south side of Chicago, famous because it included housing and other amenities for the workers and their families. Gallery cars became popular and were put into service all over the United States and Canada. Eventually, Pullman went under, but the cars continued to be made by manufacturers like Budd, St. Louis Car Company, Amarail, Canadian Vickers, and Nippon Chariot. Though the design itself dates back to the 1950s, gallery cars were built all the way up until the 2000s. The newest cars currently in service with the Virginia Railway Express are less than 10 years old. Though they were seen all over the continent, Chicago was definitely a hotspot for gallery cars. Most railway companies used them for their commuter services. This included the Chicago and Northwestern, which actually ordered the first gallery cars with driving controls. In the second half of the 20th century, many railway companies began to abandon their passenger operations, as freight was more lucrative. The federal government wanted to prevent passenger rail from disappearing altogether, and so Congress established Amtrak. The creation of Amtrak allowed railroads to abandon their passenger operations as long as they allowed Amtrak to run passenger trains on their tracks. Amtrak continues to exist today, running intercity passenger trains mostly over the tracks of private freight railroads. On the regional level, Chicago area commuter trains eventually became part of the state-operated Metra network. Since most lines were already using them, Metra kept the gallery cars, and they even ordered new ones throughout the next few decades. In fact, the future train cars, which will be built by Alstom, will be the first time Metra breaks from the gallery car design. Traditionally, gallery cars have been hauled by diesel locomotives. On the contrary, the Metra Electric Line and Indiana South Shore Line use electric multiple units known as highliners. Yet nevertheless, these highliner trains also have a floor plan identical to gallery cars, because it's the interior design that sets gallery cars apart from all other rail cars. On the outside, they just look like tall double-deck trains with one door in the middle. When you walk in, you have 2 options: head right or head left. No worries, both sides are the same. Now this is that controversial design that has lovers nostalgic, haters disgusted, and Europeans horrified. The bottom floor is nothing special, just rows of 2x2 seating with a narrow aisle. The top floor, however, well, there is no real top floor. Instead, there are 2 balconies on either side of the aisle, with 1 row of seats on each side. The balconies are accessible by a very, very narrow staircase located towards the middle of the car by the doors. In Metra's case, baggage racks span the chasm between balconies. Why would anyone design a train like this? Well, believe it or not, back in the day this was a cost-saving measure. You see, when the conductor is checking tickets, they can just stay on the bottom floor. They can interact with passengers on both floors from downstairs. What this means is that you only need 1 conductor for both levels instead of 2. Railroads were able to save big on labor costs, while still being able to offer slightly more capacity than a single-deck car. So the big question is, what's my position on gallery cars? Well, I would describe myself as kind of in the middle between being a train lover and a transit advocate. I want public transportation to be easily available, equitable, and convenient for everyone, but I also love riding strange and unique trains. So while I do think that it's an outdated design and no future train should be set up this way, I don't hate them. In fact, I actually enjoy riding them. I'll sit downstairs if I'm with someone, or upstairs if I'm traveling solo. Honestly, it's the same reason why I don't hate steam engines or monorails. Just because there are much better options doesn't mean they can't be fun to ride. Are gallery cars an important piece of American railroad history? Absolutely, and they should be preserved and enjoyed for generations to come. But is it time for these American railroads to move on and adopt better railcar designs? Also yes. Now we've talked about commuter rail so much, you might forget that we were going to bring up Amtrak. Where do they fit in all of this? Well, travel with me to a town in northern Indiana, and I'll tell you all about it. Hey everyone, it's me, Tom. I am in Valparaiso, and I know when you hear a name as exotic as that, you might think I'm in a place like California, but no, this is northwest Indiana. Valparaiso is kind of the extremity of what you could consider a Chicago suburb, as in there are people that live here that commute to Chicago, although I would never want such a long commute. Speaking of commuters, what's the public transportation situation like here in Valparaiso? Well, there is a bus system, but in terms of passenger rail, there's nothing left. So we've come to the site of the former railway station. Today, it's not much more than a parking lot next to some tracks, a line that is now owned by the Chicago, Fort Wayne, and Eastern Railroad. However, these tracks used to belong to the famous Pennsylvania Railroad, and they were part of the main line between Chicago and the eastern United States. Trains like the Broadway Limited and the Capitol Limited used these tracks, as well as commuter services. Yeah, you can totally tell that this used to be a train station. Not anymore, unfortunately. And there's been a passenger train here since at least 1869. For many years, there was a commuter service between Valparaiso and Chicago operated by the Pennsylvania Railroad, Penn Central, Conrail. See, when Amtrak took over inner-city trains, this commuter connection remained the responsibility of Penn Central, which later became Conrail. In 1979, Amtrak took over this service as well, making it one of their few commuter services. The trains were officially called the Indiana Connection and the Calumet, although over the years they've had many nicknames, like the Dummy and the Valpo Local. Now generally we think of Amtrak and we think of long-distance trains, inner-city service, and that's true for the most part, although Amtrak does and has operated some commuter-like services. Think of the Pacific Surfliner in California or the Hartford line in Connecticut. Definitely intercity in nature, but also with like integration into the regional fare system and frequent stops, etc. On weekdays, there were 2 trains going into Chicago from Valparaiso in the morning and 2 trains from Chicago to Valparaiso in the afternoon and evening. So very, very much a commuter schedule. In 1991, all long-distance trains had already been rerouted to other lines. The state of Indiana refused to fund the Calumet, and so in May of that year, the very last Calumet train stopped at Valparaiso. So what do you do if you want to go to Chicago, but you don't want to drive? The Chicago Dash Bus began running in 2008. On weekdays, 5 buses leave Valpo in the morning, stopping at 3 locations in downtown Chicago. There are also 5 buses back to Valparaiso in the afternoon. A one-way costs $9, but prices are reduced when you buy a 10-ride ticket or a monthly pass. The Valparaiso stop is located at 270 Brown Street, not too far from where the old train station was. So why did I just spend 4 minutes talking about a random Amtrak commuter train to Valparaiso that doesn't even run anymore? Well, this is what a typical consist on the Calumet looked like. Yes, those are gallery cars. I remember being so surprised when I first saw a picture of these cars in their Amtrak Phase 3 livery. These gallery cars were used on the Calumet as well as other short Midwestern routes. There were 16 cars in total. My next question would be, were they just uncomfortable commuter cars with an Amtrak paint job? The answer is not quite. See, Amtrak wasn't the initial buyer for these cars. They were hand-me-downs. The Chicago and Northwestern Railroad had been using gallery cars for their commuter services in Chicago. They loved them so much that they ordered more, but this time for intercity service. These medium-distance gallery cars were delivered in 1958. They were more luxurious than the commuter ones. Not only was the seating more comfortable, there were dining cars and parlor cars as well. Interestingly, Amtrak never took over any train routes from the Chicago and Northwestern, but they did take over these intercity gallery cars. They were repainted, renumbered, and some cars were given cabs so that Amtrak could use them in shorter consists. Amtrak used their second-hand gallery cars on various Midwestern routes until 1994, when the cars were retired. Seeing gallery cars in Chicago or Northern Virginia today, it can be strange to imagine a time when this was a revolutionary design. How much stranger to think that for many years, even Amtrak used them. I can't find any information on whether or not any of these were preserved. I would love to see one of the railroads that still operates gallery cars give one of their cars an Amtrak heritage livery someday. So that's the story behind gallery cars, Amtrak, and the Calumet. We unpacked a lot today. What's your favorite fact about these cars? Is there any unusual railway equipment where you're from? As always, let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching today. Please subscribe to Trains Are Awesome, and we'll see you next time.